Okay, good morning. Good morning. I'm very happy to see everybody here. We have a fabulous program. I would like to introduce Professor Bert Tussing, who is the Director of Homeland Defense and Security Issues at the U.S. Army War College. I look forward to his presentation.
Thank you very much, Maureen. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be with you here today. In 2020, in the beginning of the COVID crisis, FEMA asked me to come down and look at some areas that they were working. Very specifically, they were looking at potential new venue to develop strategic planners for the organization. They were looking at how to put together a stable of those planners to keep them available to them. Now, I will tell you that FEMA has a significant number of former military personnel in there, and the planning and the capabilities they have towards those ends reflect that. But they wanted to make it just a little more formal. But before I got out of there, as I was making my way back to Carlisle, they said, listen, Bert, we're working on an initiative with the United States Northern Command trying to put together what we're referring to as a strategy for national security emergencies. We're looking at it in terms of natural catastrophic incidents. We would like for you and the War College, if you would please, to take a look at it in terms of man-made catastrophic incidents. And basically what they were talking about there is the potential of war. Of course, if having my head on straight, I told them that I could not. Then again, neither could I, the Department of Homeland Security, because when you talk about a national strategy like this one, you're talking about something that has to be undertaken by the entire National Security Council. Nevertheless, with the spirit in mind of what they were trying to do, we said that we would go forward and help out to the best of our capabilities. From that point, ladies and gentlemen, what we decided to do, we were going to try and break it up into a 2-year study. The first year of that study was going to be dedicated to taking a look at the environment. What we wanted to do was take a look at the strategic environment that would be facing a catastrophic incident. We'll talk about exactly what we mean by that in a second. And then by postulating where we saw that strategic environment and the current environment, and then postulating where we would like to be, we would say, okay, that will be the end, our objective that we're seeking to attain here. And then in the traditional military approach to planning, we were going to say, what are the necessary ways, if you will, or policies or processes that will facilitate our obtaining and maintaining that objective? And what are the means or the resources that would be necessary to be applied in those ways and processes to get us where we need to be? The traditional Clausewitzian, if you will, ends, ways, and means that has defined our approach to strategy development in the military, at least at the Army War College, for some time now. And even at that, we discovered that this was something really big to take on. And it gave us a new appreciation for organizations like RAND that can really devote a lot of resources and a lot of personnel and a lot of time into subjects at hand. Nevertheless, we developed some thinking over time, which I'd like to share with you, taking us in the direction of what we would need for a national security emergency brought about by an attack against our people. Now, when we talk about things like national security emergencies, this is the definition that we begin with. This came out of the Reagan administration, and as you can see here, it's pretty straightforward. It talks about any type of occurrence, including a natural disaster, a military attack, a technical emergency, or any other kind of emergency that, listen here, seriously degrades or even seriously threatens the national security of the United States. And ladies and gentlemen, I want you to lock in on those two words, national security, because that kind of gives us a framework for the rest of the discussion we're going to have this afternoon. Because when we talk about this sort of thing, we're talking about the effect that it has upon the entire nation. And when we use words like national security, that takes us to the top of the priority list on what we're willing to do in terms of expenditure of manpower and other resources for the sake of the country. FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security utilizes words like disasters, major disasters, emergencies, and then even catastrophic events. And they use those types of words to act as sort of a rheostat, if you will, of just how much we are going to be devoting to addressing the problem at hand. But nothing gets higher in terms of our sense of urgency in the nation than something that threatens the national security. Now, here's the other fun part about this. You and I could not today go together and find a governmental definition of national security. It's kind of like artwork for those of us like Knuckle Dragon Marine that I am. I don't know what good art is, but I know what I like, and I know when I see it, that must be it. Well, the same thing may be true in our approach to national security, because we haven't really defined it. And I would speculate that that's probably a good thing, because occasionally when we find ourselves in governmental definitions, we end up painting ourselves into a corner to where someone who is against a particular direction we may be taking would say, that's not what you defined as the issue. So we're starting off at kind of an advantage and disadvantage at the same time with what do we mean by national security. I will leave that right now to your speculation. We may pick up on it a little bit in the course of our discussion today. But as we go forward with all of this, I will tell you that the definition has evolved over time to where we arrive at a new definition in the Department of Homeland Security, which is driving the issues for us, that being catastrophic incident. Now, when you look at this definition, there are key phrases, once again, that I want us to really focus on because this drives our thinking. Notice again, please, that it's any natural or man-made incident to include terrorism. And including terrorism is evident of the time that the definitions came together. This was following 9/11. This was preceding what has grown to be reemergence of nation-state threats against our people. But you can see that's what was driving the thinking at the time. But notice, please, next, what it talks about in the definition. An incident which results in extraordinary levels of mass casualties, damage, disruption, seriously affecting the population, the infrastructure, the environment, the economy, national morale. And wait a minute. If you say something like national morale, that sounds a little fluffy to a lot of people. That's a little too ethereal in a lot of people, especially real pragmatists, saying, no, what do you really mean? But before we walk away from it, if someone were to ask you today how many battles we lost in Vietnam, I would suggest that you would respond, none. How many campaigns did we lose in Vietnam? None. But does anyone in that room today think that we won the war in Vietnam? Or is anyone not willing to admit that we lost the war in Vietnam? And the simple fact of the matter is we did. And the reason for that was not because our military didn't have the capability. It's because we as a nation lost the will to continue the battle. So when we talk about something as ethereal, as fluffy, if you will, as national morale becomes very, very important in the discussion. But as we continue to look at this definition, it goes on beyond that. It talks about an incident which could have a sustained national impact over a prolonged period of time. Now let's stop with that for just a second, because I want to frame things just a little bit better for us as we go forward with our thinking. When we talk about a sustained national impact and we measure that against what we have seen in your and my lifetimes in the United States, then it becomes a different level, a different degree of severity. Most of the things that you and I have seen, even current events that we're watching with Hurricane Helene, followed immediately by Hurricane Milton in Florida, which will probably exceed the damage that we saw in Katrina. We're still talking about something that happens in an individual state or in an individual region, but we're not talking about something that is a national level impact. And when we talk about prolonged period of time, why is that important in the discussion? As we talk this morning, we're going to be talking about critical infrastructure, which basically is defined as infrastructure which is so vital to the United States that its destruction or its disruption could lead to a series of events which, by the definition, says could have a debilitating impact upon the country. Well, that's awfully highfalutin in terms of just how it sounds. But let me give you Tussing's corollary to this thing. What this means is if you take out these systems, you can begin a series of events that will bring the country to its knees. When we talk about critical infrastructure, we break those down into sectors. There are 16 different sectors that DHS deals with, the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA deals with. And one of those, just one of those, is the power grid. Now, when we talk about the power grid and restoration of the power grid, we all know how important that is. Everything else kind of depends upon power. But when we look at some of the most devastating series of events that you and I have witnessed in modern times, let's look at Katrina. And we saw that even in the most devastated areas of the Gulf Coast region of Katrina, those three states were impacted. 85 to 95% of the power was restored to the impacted area within 2 weeks' time. That's not bad. But now let's pause for a second and try and frame what we're thinking about with catastrophic incidents. First of all, let me tell you that I would suggest that there hasn't been a catastrophic incident in the United States since perhaps the Great Dust Bowl crisis of the 1930s, where basically 770,000 people had to move away from their homes because it was no longer sustainable. The land was just unlivable. We haven't seen anything since that was that devastating or that national in its impact. Now, maybe prior to that, maybe the Spanish flu crisis of 1918, which of course was not Spanish flu, it was another pandemic, which even exceeded what we saw recently in the COVID crisis. Maybe that was a catastrophic event. But we have not experienced anything within the United States since that time. We've seen it other places. In 2004, we witnessed what happened with the great Indonesian earthquake crises. Or let's bring it even closer. In 2011, we saw the conflagration of a catastrophic natural event with a catastrophic man-made event, if you will, a catastrophic accident in Japan with Fukushima and what occurred there. But we have not seen it in the United States. We need to think about that. So, okay, a catastrophic incident for a long period of time. Then what else? Well, it almost immediately exceeds the resources that are normally available to state, local, tribal, territorial, or even private sector authorities in the impacted regions. Okay, and that's an important thing for us to keep in mind too, because as we talk about strategies in the United States, especially national strategies, they are, as they should be, developed at the federal level. But they are developed at the federal level to serve the constituencies at state, local, tribal, territorial governance, and even within the private sector. So this becomes very, very important because those people ought to be involved in the development of the strategy, all of which significantly interrupts governmental operations and emergency services to such an extent that there's those two words, that national security could be threatened. Now, not to be outdone, the Department of Defense has come up with its own definition. One I want to share with you here, the definition being complex catastrophe. Now look at this one, and I will tell you that a friend of mine, Dr. Paul Stockton, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and America's Security Affairs at the time, he and his staff came up with this definition. And I will tell you they came up with the definition because they were faced with three major events in the time that Paul was in office. The first of those events was Hurricane Sandy. And you all will remember the impact of Hurricane Sandy, especially in the Northeast, in an area that is not nearly as familiar and nearly as prepared for hurricanes as we see, for instance, in the southeast corner of the United States. Incredible devastation, incredible response, but that is one of the things that slapped Paul in the face. And then the next thing that happened was they had an exercise led by the United States Northern Command and FEMA, looking at what would happen if the New Madrid fault actually occurred, if the earthquakes that we've been concerned about with New Madrid actually occurred. Now, just for your reference, the New Madrid fault earthquake hasn't occurred since the early 1800s, 1827. And it was a series of earthquakes that occurred at that time. I don't mean to be overly descriptive, but it was so devastating, it rang church bells in Boston. It reversed the flow of the Mississippi River, and it destroyed things to such a degree. Out of the exercise, they postulated that it would take 18 to 24 months to restore power in the impacted regions over 8 states across 4 different FEMA regions. And folks, without power, you don't have water flowing. You don't have much of the transportation industry working. You do not have refrigeration. Now, that sounds kind of almost light in its impact. But there are people in the room there like me who have friends who are diabetic, friends, families, loved ones who are diabetic. And you all know how dependent they are upon refrigerated medicines, right? They postulated that within 2 weeks' time, you would be looking at something in the neighborhood of 1.2 million deaths from that population. That's how severe we're talking about here. That's how important these critical life-sustaining infrastructure sectors are. So when you look at a complex catastrophe, and from the viewpoint of DoD, they said this would include cyberspace attacks, power grid failure, I wonder how that came about, and terrorism, which results in cascading failures of multiple interdependent critical life-sustaining infrastructure sectors and causes, once again, extraordinary levels of mass casualties, damage, disruption, severely affecting the population, the environment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you see the differences here between what we have experienced in terms of disasters and major disasters to date and what we could expect to experience in the event of a catastrophic incident, a complex catastrophe, whether natural or man-made. So the main distinctions I would suggest that we take out of this is, first of all, the enormity of what we're talking about here. Just how huge the impact is. Not a state, not a region, but the entire country, either in terms of the immediate effects or the secondary and tertiary effects that would come out of an incident of this size. The second thing is the immediacy. I don't mean to take anything away from how we've responded to things so far, or how we've prepared for things so far. But one of the things that we deal with most often, and it's very, very apparent to us and very, very poignant to us right at this moment, is hurricanes. But let me tell you something. Any government official who is caught off guard by a hurricane really ought to be removed from office pretty quickly. You can see it developing as a ripple off the west coast of Africa, and it's making its way all the way across the ocean. We might not know how severe it's going to be when it hits, but it's not going to be a surprise. Earthquakes aren't like that. Pandemics, in a very real way, aren't like that. So you see the severity of what we're talking about here. So enormity, immediacy, and then this one here, the enduring impact. Not a matter of days, not a matter of weeks, but perhaps a matter of months and months and months into a year. And all of this, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest to you, leads us to a situation that calls for action because we are facing a situation that may result in an existential threat to our people. Now, I will tell you that several good friends of mine have tried to talk me off of this ledge, but I think it's important for us to frame it in these terms, maybe not a complete destruction of our country, but even worse to some of us, the idea of an end of what we have seen in this great experiment that Lincoln described as democracy. Over time, having lost the institutions, having lost the societal ethos, having lost who we are as a people. So as we go forward with that bright picture, we tried to take on this study here at the War College by addressing the issue. And the first thing that we said is that the confluence of emerging and re-emerging nation-state threats against our people, alongside of what I've already described to you as foreseeable natural catastrophic incidents or complex catastrophes on this national scale, compels the United States to develop a strategy for national security emergencies. Now, as we do that, I would suggest to you all that we need to reimagine Homeland Security in view of this reemergence of nation-state threats and the potential out of those nation-state threats of a direct attack against our national critical infrastructure and other domestic national interests, against our people, against our infrastructure, against our institutions. And then finally, I would suggest to you that immediately out of this, some lead federal agency, which I suggest to you is probably going to have to be the Department of Homeland Security, with FEMA as the executing agency, is going to have to set the conditions for a transition to national mobilization, a modern civil defense, and restoration of critical infrastructure in the event of war. Now, the study's intent as we continued on, therefore, is to first of all assist in the development of this strategy for national security emergencies. As we wanted to do that, we wanted to continue with the focus that FEMA provided for us into addressing this in terms of nation-state threats. Being aware of the type of destruction that can come from other things, but looking at it in terms, very deliberate terms, of an attack against our people by a nation state. At the same time, we wanted to take a look at it in providing a framework for a whole of nation mobilization and execution. Now, let me pause here for just a second to try and bring you in on our thinking on that. Frequently, as we try to address complex problems in the United States, we talk about it in terms of whole of government. This isn't something that the Department of Defense takes on, or the Department of Homeland Security takes on by itself, or even any one of the departments in the National Security Council. We suggest that this has to be taken on holistically in terms of the government response. But here's the thing. The government's greatest responsibility, I would suggest to you all, is to framing a direction for the people to go writ large. So, for instance, at the top of the pyramid, as I suggested before, the federal government should be responsible for bringing together plans or strategies to direct a nation in times of crises. As they put those things together, state, local, tribal, territorial governments should be the implementer of those strategies to the best of their capabilities. But I would suggest to you, even at that the best that they can do for their constituency is to act as orchestrators for the type of preparations for, and if necessary, mitigation, response, and recovery to what we see as the threats against our people. So, whole of nation, therefore, talks about not only governmental solutions, but solutions that come about and are facilitated by organizations, private volunteer organizations, by communities themselves, by families, by individuals. bringing together the nation in a return to a feeling of a traditional, not only governmental, but civic responsibility in taking care of our requirements. As we do so, we are going to focus, especially the military is going to focus on defeating the adversary, to be sure, but the country writ large, and to a degree, the military as well, has got to also focus on managing the consequences of the assault of our adversary against our people. This is something I want us to be thinking about here, because for most of our lives, we've looked upon the United States as being basically, outside of the nuclear threat, being basically beyond the threat of an attack against our people. We have these two wonderful oceans, which serve like the greatest moats in the world. We have benevolent neighbors to our north and our south that have basically would act as buffers. We have not imagined or prepared for the type of attack that could be coming against us. As we look upon this thing, this is going to call for a degree of civil and military interaction and a degree of public and private sector preparations to a degree that we have not seen before. And when we talk about the public side of the public and private sector preparations, we are talking about governmental entities, but once again, we're talking about all the governmental entities, federal, state, local, tribal, territorial. Giving you all of that as a setup, I'm going to spring right now to our major findings, and then we'll describe some other things that led us to those findings along the way. And here's the first thing. This is the most sobering thing for me. It's very, very simple. The next time we go to war, war is coming to us. We're going to feel it. We're going to feel it perhaps kinetically, perhaps cybernetically, but it's coming to us. And anyone who thinks that we would be able to go to war against what we refer to now as the pacing threat of the Chinese or the acute threat of the Russians, I believe that they are blinding themselves to the obvious. The capability is there, and I believe before we finish talking today, you may see that the intent is there as well. Here's the next thing. Preparing for, responding to, and recovering from national security emergencies is going to require an extraordinary prioritization in the appropriation and allocation of resources. Now, what does that mean to you and I? Ladies and gentlemen, you and I are blessed in having been born or raised in the most blessed country in the history of the world. In terms of the resources available to us, in terms of the richness available to our people, there hasn't been another nation in the history of the world where all of our people were able to enjoy that. But as a function of that, I would suggest to you, we have become inured to the idea of potential need, critical need. What I described to you in the potential crisis out of a New Madrid earthquake, or potential crises in other areas of the country, some of you from the Northwest are probably aware and concerned about the Cascadia subduction zones in that area. And having seen what happened in COVID, I think we can all be aware of other incredible, massive, catastrophic natural issues in terms of disease that can come upon our people. It's there. But we, to date, haven't had to deal with the idea of limited resources. And I would suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, if we find ourselves at war, that will be the case. For the first time, the President of the United States or his duly appointed lead federal agency will look across the depth and breadth of the needs in the country and point out to those 54 sovereigns who call themselves governors, okay, you're hurting over there, you're hurting over there, and you're hurting more than anyone else. And here's where we're going to apply our resources for the time being, and the rest of you are going to have to wait out. Intellectually, we've kind of, I think, can buy into that. But having experienced what happened out of the COVID crisis, I would ask you all, how aligned is our thinking currently to arrive at that type of common conviction? And therefore, I would suggest to you that we need to start developing deliberate partnerships right now in constructing and exercising these plans and strategies in order to ameliorate the impact of this type of prioritization. This isn't something we want to spring upon our people. We can imagine it right now, but we have to begin the process of enlisting the people into the mindset that is going to prepare us for where we need to go. And then finally, as we continue on here, I wanted to let you know something else. As we are trying to work our way out of a situation like this one, we can count on hostile foreign influences conducting, or continuing to conduct, I should say, strategic communication campaign plans characterized by misinformation and disinformation and malinformation that will greatly exacerbate the conditions that we would encounter in a national security emergency. And then finally, ladies and gentlemen, and for those of you in the military or having been in the military, this might be a little more shocking, maybe that's the term, strategies and plans are not particularly well valued in our society and even in our government. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, once again, for those of you who served in the military, I would suggest to you, all of us somewhere along the way were assigned responsibilities for something that we didn't have the resources to accomplish or the authorities to accomplish. But in dealing with something like this, the first thing I would want people to realize is that in aligning authorities to responsibilities, that is not the same thing as providing the capabilities and capacities to do it. Now, when we talk about this in terms of lead federal agencies, for instance, one would automatically assume, for instance, that we're talking about a Homeland Defense type issue that would fall to the Department of Defense to be the lead federal agency. But does anyone remember who the first lead federal agency was designated to take care of the COVID crisis? It was the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, if anyone knows anything about the National Security Council and the interagency, you know that they don't have the background, they don't have the capabilities, they don't have the institutional history of bringing together the types of plans to execute what we saw in the COVID crisis. So this is something we've got to be thinking about. And therefore, the next part of our thinking would be, okay, how does the lead federal agency, if you define what that lead federal agency is, how do they do what needs to be done? Now, once again, for all those old soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines who may be in the audience, you and I know that we had the great advantage here in that we worked according to what we refer to as command and control. And we knew right away who was in charge. That general, that admiral, that colonel, whatever along the way, there was no question in our military minds. And we would do whatever they said to do as long as it was lawful for us to do that. But those who've worked in the government beyond that, they know that the rest of government isn't part of a matter of command and control, it's a matter of cooperation and coordination. When we deal with something like this, we've got to recognize that implementation has got to kind of go beyond that. We don't have the time to deal with the immediacy of the situations. So out of our study, we said, you know what? Lead federal agencies have got to have directive authority over their interagency partners. And ladies and gentlemen, there's nothing automatic about that. And then in a moment of hubris, and I will put myself on report in this particular situation, we said that lead federal agencies ought to have the same sort of directive authority over state and local and tribal and territorial governance. And this is where I had a senior advisory group and a former assistant secretary for Homeland Defense on my senior advisory group. And he looked at me across the table and said, Bert, what you're saying is absolutely logical and dead on arrival. Because in these United States, ladies and gentlemen, we have an inbred inclination towards sovereignty for our states, and even for localities and things like that. And whereas the President of the United States might want to jump up on his or her desk and immediately declare, listen, Article 2 of the Constitution says that I have not only the responsibility, but the authority to direct what is needed to be done in the service of my constituency, at which point those other 54 sovereigns I talked about jump up on their collective desk and said, I'll see your Article 2 and raise you a 10th Amendment, which indicates that unless the specific authority is delegated to you by the Constitution, it remains with the people, and that would be us. So as we went to that second area here that we're talking about, we said that the federal government must have the ability to orchestrate federal, state, local, tribal, territorial government efforts toward prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery against an adversary's action during times of war. We have got to lead, but we've got to remember that lead isn't always command. And then an extension of that, the federal government has got to retain the authority, if you will, to orchestrate requirements with the private sector. Now, the last time we saw that done in a massive way, ladies and gentlemen, was in World War II, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his government basically took over a lot of the major industries that we had in the United States and said, okay, yesterday you were making automobiles, today you're going to be making tanks, or you're going to be making airplanes, or you're going to be doing something, which provided for the industrial base that won that war. We did it a little bit in the COVID crisis, as you may recall. There were some air conditioner agencies, for instance, that suddenly became put into the business of developing ventilators, as we saw a national requirement for that. But this is something that we've got to get back into our thinking, and we've got to get it into our thinking ahead of time, not as a matter of response. And then there's this portion of the equation that we've got to deal with. There's got to be an assessment mechanism behind all of this. There's got to be something that says, okay, what you've come up with, what you've worked feverishly to put together will really work. Now, here is another area that I think we need to be very concerned about. I will tell you with no malice aforethought or feeling against any other governmental institution that nobody plans the way the United States military plans. Nobody goes to the degree of detail, that agonizing want to stick your pin in your own eye, that the military will do to get down to the nitnoid detail to see a plan through execution. Because they realize that doing less than that may be measured in terms of blood on the field of battle. We've got to instill that same sort of, not desire, I believe the desire there, but the type of capability that you're going to need to develop these types of plans and strategies. And then you're going to have to exercise those plans and strategies. And what we try to do in the military is to exercise the strategy and the plan until we break it, because that reveals the vulnerabilities to the plan, and that's what we will address in further planning. Nobody else thinks like that. Nobody else plans to that degree, and we need it. Openly, I will say that this describes extremist conditions, and this is something that no one wants to see happen. But waiting for something to happen is not the time to say, well, what do you think we ought to do now? We've got to prepare towards these sorts of things so that when the crisis comes, we don't have to begin by people asking a lot of questions and going back to what is, unfortunately, the trending process of fighting one another simply because we are from different organizations. Some of the insights that led us to all of this, well, here's the first one: the history of United States concern for preparedness. Not waiting for something to happen and then reacting, but the history of our concern for preparedness has basically been cyclical, as has been the development of agencies to oversee that preparedness. Now, what am I talking about here? You can go back as recently as the Truman administration, and you saw with the emergence of the nuclear threat, we started to develop offices of emergency management and offices of civil defense. And then the Eisenhower administration combined those offices. And then the Kennedy administration separated the offices again, but kept them going, and so on and so forth, until the Nixon administration dissolved those types of agencies because we had arrived at détente. And that led us into an ill-advised feeling of complacency that said, okay, we really don't have to worry about this as much. But then as things continued to evolve, a gentleman from Georgia named Jimmy Carter, who knew a little about nuclear, said, you know what? No, the problem is not over. The problem is still with us, and the problem may be worse. And he developed an agency called the Federal Emergency Management Agency, at that time an all hazards agency, looking at both natural and man-made disasters, up to and including war. And that continued along on that line until the Clinton administration, at which time President Clinton brought with him to Washington a genuine rock star in the natural disaster community named James Lee Witt. And this was 2 years after the wall had come down. And at that point, James Lee Witt convinced the President of the United States, listen, the wall is down. The Russians just want to be our friends. The Chinese just want to come into the global community. Kumbaya, all is well. So listen, all this stuff that we have devoted to preparing for catastrophic war type incident, we can kind of put that to the side, because we can use those resources into preparing for things like Hurricane Andrew, which we had experienced a few years before, at which time FEMA did not look all that great in their response. And so we led ourselves down the garden path until about 2017, folks, when North Korea started popping off ballistic missiles that could reach the United States, at which time we were jolted from what a friend of mine in FEMA referred to as a 30-year strategic slumber. Here's the other thing. Up until now, our approach to emergencies, disasters, and major disasters has been dominantly reactive. Once again, something happens and then we flood the area with resources, with capabilities, because we can, because we're the richest country in the history of the world. But what happens when we have that catastrophic incident? What happens when the resources aren't there? Then I would suggest to you once again that maybe a little bit of preparation would be a better thing than a consistent reaction. Here's the next thing. Our strategy outside of the Pentagon, that five-sided wind tunnel you and I have grown to know and love, our strategies across the government aren't really strategies. Basically, what they are descriptions of the doctrine and processes that the different governmental entities use. And that's okay, but it doesn't get us to the development of objectives, to the development of requirements to meet those objectives, of ways, to the recognition and the identification of resources by which those ways can be executed in order to achieve and attain and maintain those ends. That's what we're talking about here. Our strategies, the ones that we do have, lack means for implementation and assessment. If you work in a cooperation and coordination environment all the time, That means that you're willing to sign on for a lot of painstaking scrutiny in times of stress that we really can't afford to take on in situations of the severity that we're talking about here. Our federalist system of government severely limits centralization. And with that limitation of centralization, we lose a degree of effectiveness and efficiency. And I'm not backing away from this for a second. In 1975, I swore to support and defend, and I will continue to do so, even from my position of talking a lot now, but not doing much anymore. But we swear to defend that. That's who we are as a people. But I think we have to recognize, too, that there may be times when we have to deviate from that in times of crises. Someday I've got to take a little bit of extra time to find out who actually said this for the first time, but some very wise individual said, you know what? The Constitution is not a suicide pact. And if we're going to deviate, we have to plan for that deviation, lest we go too far astray. Continuing with our insights, we said, you know what? If we're going to ask the state and local governments, if we're going to ask the private sector to do this sort of thing, and we want to do that in partnership, then we've got to act like a partner from the federal government. And that may mean the provision of grants, deregulation in some areas, and other incentives which can lead the states and local governments and the private sector to a better position to jump in on this preparedness issue. We're asking them, after all, let's face it, even as severe as we're talking about here, we're asking them to invest in something that might not happen. But dear God, if it does happen and we're not prepared for it, then where are we going to be? Here's the next thing, sharing information. I will tell you, since I arrived at the Army War College, every issue that I've seemed to work on around here gets down to a question of balancing need to know with need to share. Somebody in the audience is going to say, well, yeah, but this is classified, and it is classified, and therefore we can't make it absolutely open. But maybe we need to be a little less prescriptive about what type of information should and should not be classified. And especially when we talk about doing something which is going to maybe mean the difference between continuing as we are as a people and forever changing the atmosphere and the complexion of our country. Here's the next one. Adversaries can be expected in times of crises to manipulate the government's message and to promulgate false narratives to continue to sow fear and discontent among our people and to erode the confidence of our people in their governmental institutions in times of most dire need. Every night I go to bed and I pray that this does not come about, because I know if I wake up tomorrow morning, we will not be prepared as a people. Not just in terms of having the right policies, but even in having the right attitude to come together. We need to get this together. And I will leave that to your own personal observations. And then finally, once again, putting myself on report, we had a wonderful young lady working with us on this project from afar. She was with USAID and she was in New Delhi, India. And she came up almost quietly and said, you know, as we're doing all of this, as we're asking so much of our people and our institutions, should we not be also aware of where this may be taking the rights and civil liberties, even if we are willing to put aside momentarily for the good of the sustainment of the society? How much do we need to make people aware that we want to go rushing back as rapidly as possible to who we are as defined by those things? Some of the greatest champions of democracy in the history of our country have deviated, perhaps necessarily, perhaps unnecessarily, in times of great crises. President Lincoln with the writs of habeas corpus, President Wilson with the Sedition Acts, President Roosevelt with incarceration of Japanese Americans. Would they have done that if we had done a little more preparation, a little more planning, a little more thinking along the way? I don't know. So when we wrap all this up, when we talk about a national preparedness system framework defined by presidential policy decision back in the Bush administration, carried in the Obama administration, we talk in terms of being of prevention and protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And I will remind you over time that we've been pretty good in response and recovery, not always efficient, but effective. But you and I hope, now are arriving at a conviction that we've got to go beyond response and recovery, and we've got to really think in terms of preparedness. If you divide that preparedness system right in the middle, and you think of what's going to happen before the event, sometimes we call it left of boom, that's where we've got to be thinking, folks, more in terms of left of boom. That's what I had to share with you all today, and I hope I haven't gone over my time. Maureen, if I have, please excuse me.
We're going to just shift gears a little bit because Bert focused heavily on how we need to think about the U.S. response and what this may mean for the homeland. For me, at least, when I heard Bert talk originally, I thought, okay, so what do I know about the adversary? Who am I really worried about? That's when I went to my historian to my right and asked Barbara to just give us a little insight on how we think about how our prime adversary, which is Russia, how do we think about them in terms of these kinds of threats? And that may help motivate us to get into that preparedness. So, Barbara, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself.
I'm Barbara Walker. I'm from the Department of History at UNR. My field is Russian history, back from the Middle Ages up to the present. I teach largely at this moment on Putin. I just want to say that Bert's talk is absolutely right on and essential, because from what I understand, I do think we will be invaded, and I think we're being softened up for it right now. And I think it's incredibly important to try to think about maybe what we got wrong in the Cold War and how we could improve on that. The problem of identifying the enemy is a major, major issue. And that Cold War phrase, know your enemy. Well, I would say we really lost track on that front, insofar as for internal American political reasons, we ended up blaming communism. I would argue that that led us massively astray, insofar as I would argue that it was a matter of inner Eurasian political tactics and strategies that go back at least 1,000 years. Mr. Putin thinks in very, very long stretches of time, and slow degradation is very much part of the inner Eurasian tactic. So I want to talk just a little bit about how it might help us to think of the threat as inner Eurasian politics, strategies, structures, and tactics. So yes, was it really about communism? Is this actually from an inner Eurasian empire? So what got me going on this thinking was teaching about Mr. Putin and listening to his comments over and over again in his interviews, for example, with Tucker Carlson, his efforts to kind of reach back into history, especially medieval history, to understand his own place and role in Russian history and in the world history. The most important thing to understand about inner Eurasian politics is that it's all about holding together an incredibly varied number of ethnic interests and maintaining some degree of national security against the outside world. In terms of what Russia has experienced beginning from its very earliest years, was first a really amazing empire that was based in Kiev, that drew on incredible riches of literacy and art from the Byzantine Empire, which was very easily destroyed by the Mongols. It's really that experience of the Mongols and generally of repeated outside attacks that lead to internal conflict. There's a constant series of invasions, especially from pastoralists, which is what Mongols were. Those invasions sort of reached a peak in the mid-13th century. Then came something called the appanage era, which basically means we were divided. It was appanage means feudal sort of territory, and the Mongols were really good at playing these feudal princes and territories against each other. Something to remember about inner Eurasian politics. The real struggle for the Muscovite princes, that era that Putin identifies with, was called the gathering in of Russia. And this is where you begin to see an aggressive, defensive, expansive political strategy that I would argue plays out to the present day, a fear of invasion that leads to the constant desire to control borders, aka Eastern Europe after World War II, to really control them out of a fear of invasion, whether rational or not. The time of troubles was a period in which this degree of dissension inside Russia itself became a kind of hallmark of everything that Russian leadership concerned with national security wanted to avoid. Was when they were being invaded by Germans and Lithuanians and Swedes, and they were getting themselves into the government and turning Russians against each other. That is the model of what you don't want to be, is turned against each other. And that is the essence of what they're trying to avoid for themselves and use to soften up others. our immediate post-war response, why we actually turned to the problem of communism as the reason for our difficulties with the Soviet Union. Really, the problem was Stalinism. His incredible depredations of the Russian and Soviet people became especially visible in 1948 when Stalin pretty much turns into satellite states, the Eastern European countries. And there was a lot of different internal reasons, the McCarthy phenomenon, the attacks on the State Department, the attacks on scholars of the region, that meant that it was safest for people in the non-governmental intelligence community, I would think of Russian studies as having been in the 1950s, to protect themselves and to get funding. And funding came to fight against communism. And so this was very much the direction that my community took, especially in the social sciences. Political science was huge, and Harvard was huge in all of this. The impact of deciding who the enemy was in 1948, pressures to unite left and right against what was clearly seen as an expansive Soviet threat, led us to stop thinking about what the real problem was. I just want to say that our problem is with both Russia and China because Russia and China are both inner Eurasian empires. They have an incredibly deep history as frenemies. They go back and forth. Remember that they are in deep competition with each other at the same time that they are sort of collaborating to try to, get the Western world. And the ways that they do that have to do with how they're competing for power with each other. Something that we kind of tend to leave out of our considerations. Putin at this point is really sort of a client, with Xi the patron, but he doesn't want to stay that way. And his way out is to make the US a client state, because that would help him in terms of his inner Eurasian power balance. One of the most recent expressions of that is the expansionism to Ukraine. They still kind of see Ukraine as kind of this territory that they own. What I think we can talk about now is the globalization of inner Eurasian defensive aggression, insofar as we are being inundated by, and I would not say misinformation, I would say disinformation, in all kinds of areas. The internet and social media have made us incredibly vulnerable to disinformation because we aren't very good at identifying it. I'm an ardent reader of the Wall Street Journal, so I'm watching the moderators there of the comment section, just struggle to control this issue. The New York Times, too, at this point. I recognize this stuff because I studied the 60s when the KGB was beginning to formulate some of these attacks that we actually see in very similar form today. A lot of this disinformation strategy is, in fact, to destroy American morale, to turn us against each other, and to make us people who don't have a strategy, to make us people who just respond from our guts, pursue our own immediate interests, and don't really think about our nation. The question is, how can we defend against this? Do we have the capacity to? Is this like a lost battle? I certainly think that Bert is raising the essential questions about how we deal with the threat of inner Eurasian imperial strategy, culture, political culture, or military tactics in such a way that we can preserve this absolutely extraordinary thing that is our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. The reason I wanted Barbara here was because I wanted you to think about the threats differently. We're all old enough to remember the era of duck and cover. We're not in duck and cover. We need to think about the threats differently. As she said, the disinformation threats, how things are coming at us, and that has to be part of the strategy. So with that, questions. I'm going to start this with Bert. In the event of a major infrastructure failure, what is the probability that current administrations might consider declaring things like martial law? And what would that look like? And how does that go to your last point about protecting civil liberties in the time of an emergency?
It is a good question. It's a sobering question. It's something that we need to think about. But one of the things I wanted to reinstall in our thinking here is the more that we prepare before an incident, the less we will have to go to a knee-jerk reaction such as martial law. I will tell you, martial law is one of the most misunderstood things. Martial law was a relic of the times when we went out west. We were making our way across west. The only law type capability that you had there was what the military could bring to bear in protecting the settlers from the Indians and such as that. We have not declared martial law in this country since those days. This is not something we want to do. We want to maintain a very clear distinction between what is law enforcement and what is defense, because the American people want our soldiers to be soldiers and our policemen to be policemen, and they want our military to be their servant, never, ever, ever their overseer. We have three major power systems in the United States: East, West, and Texas. I know that sounds funny in and of itself, but hey, if you've got any Texans in the crowd, they're saying, well, yeah. When you talk about those things, they were built not with the idea that someone would deliberately try and take them down. Who would want to turn the lights out? Who would want to put our people in that sort of situation? Well, we have the answer now. Now we have a greater threat than we've ever had before. We're working towards making stronger grids, stronger distribution systems all the way across the board, but we've still got a good ways to go. So I hope that's helpful.
Excellent. Thank you, Bert. Barbara, I'm going to bounce to you a question about Russia's structure and what happens inside of that structure. Russia has been called an entity of oligarchs and clans, which supports a system of corruption. In these kinds of traditional systems, how do they actually control what happens, and how do they get that centralized control to be effective, and how does that affect their foreign policy? Question is, who really is in control?
Well, I would call it a gangster state. And this is one of the reasons that I really think we lost the Cold War. If it had anything to do with making that a safer place for people who aspire to good lives, we just lost in a big way. What ultimately happened, probably the best book on this, is Catherine Belton's book called Putin's People. Absolutely superb piece of especially economic and financial analysis, showing how what was the KGB beginning in the 1970s began sort of a system of shell companies and financial finagling, which they pursued throughout the rest of the period, strengthening in the 1990s, and then with Mr. Putin essentially took over, defeated the oligarchs, by the way. The oligarchs were people that were dividing the country from Mr. Putin's perspective. Putin seemed like a pretty mild kind of character. Au contraire, he is just really good at pulling together gangsters. And it was very clear the relationship between the FSB, the successor to the KGB, and the sort of the Russian gangster system. How do they keep control? Another book that I teach is called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, by the son of Soviet dissidents who left the country and went to England in, I think, the 70s. His name is Vladimir Pomerantsev. He went back to the motherland to kind of figure out what was going on there, and worked in the television industry in the 2000s and watched propaganda state being built up. And it was a matter of aligning internal interests, a very slow process, aligning internal economic interests, the desire of the Russian people just to move on from the stress of the Cold War, the stress of the financial collapse in the late 1990s, and just get happy news, or just get some kind of sense that they could trust that their safety was safe, so to speak. So national security in the most personal sense. The entire television industry came to be built up around that, totally propagandistic, massively packed with disinformation for the Russian people.
Thank you, Barbara. Bert, the question is about the prioritization of resources. So you emphasized preparedness. And as we know, and as is the US government's habit, we tend to invest a lot after the fact, not before the fact. So what can be done to encourage much more investment on that preparedness side, and we're actually making a difference on the front end and not just responding to the next crisis at hand?
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you to who asked the question. Let me take two deliberate stances on this. The first one is governmentally. What groups like yours can start doing is to ask the questions out loud. Just how prepared are we for a catastrophic incident? What are we doing to prepare in ways that we as citizens cannot, in terms of capabilities and capacities which are beyond that which we have? Just keep in mind that emergency management in the United States, basically until the middle of the last century, was a matter of community. And if the community came together, then you were okay. And if the community didn't come together, then there was not much else out there. People forget that Katrina was the second time in the 20th century that New Orleans was nearly wiped off the map. In too many areas of the country, we have now gone back to an automatic knee-jerk reaction that something bad has happened. What is the government doing? As opposed to what are we doing ourselves, which brings me to the second tier of this. What are we doing to prepare ourselves individually? What am I doing to prepare myself? What am I doing to prepare my family? What am I doing to prepare my community? What am I doing to prepare the most vulnerable sectors of our community? So we've got to take this on. When I say that the government has an absolute responsibility to frame our response, they do. They have an absolute responsibility to provide direction in terms of strategies and plans and things like that. But you don't have to wait for the final solution from the federal government to come down before we start a bottom-up approach to these sorts of things. We have to take this on as a society if we indeed are interested in being a society.
Thank you, Bert. And I'm going to close with Barbara. What is the strategy? What has worked historically for countering those times of troubles? And is that something that can be applied for us as well as part of the preparedness?
Insofar as it united right and left in the United States, it created a common outside enemy that from the populist level on up, people could believe was an enemy. I think we need to expand our knowledge. We need to get control of our media somehow, not to prevent free speech, but to prevent disinformation. I do not have any idea how to do that. My students said, but social media is the mainstream media today. Nobody in my generation gets information from those publications. I don't know. There has to be some way to pull us together. Unfortunately, it's often an outside enemy that helps us to do that. Maybe just somehow beginning to celebrate being citizens of the US somehow and not just allowing ourselves to be dragged around by our gut through sensationalistic misinformation. Fingers crossed.
Thank you, Barbara. I think a good place to start is to learn your history. So at least you know where we are and where it comes from. Bert, do you have a parting message?
Yes, ma'am. One of the first things that we teach our students, but the first thing we do is we sit down and we say, all right, let's talk about critical thinking. And why do we think the way that we do? And be willing to ask those questions. We need to get that out. We need to get it in universities. We need to get it into our secondary schools. We need to be asking why we're doing that. Someone will rise up in anger. They won't acknowledge the idea that we're trying to teach people to think. They're going to say we're trying to teach people what to think, and that's not the point. We should ask questions. We should teach our children to ask questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you all for being here. It was a wonderful discussion.